He was already shaking and like you could see his soul leaving his body. But there was a guy that was there. I noticed him. Lazarus came to the right side of the door and then he opened it. Then, pow, the gun went off. He shot immediately.
Why didn't you stay at the hospital?
Because Lazarus was dead.
She said what she said. I immediately shut down. I can't. That's it. I can't. That's it. I don't want to hear nothing. I can't take this.
Have you ever wondered how far someone could go to escape a toxic relationship? Well, Genesis Patricia Tanksley's chilling story could have you second-guessing everything about what you think people are capable of. In the dead of night, a life was nearly lost after a betrayal, a shocking act of violence, and a woman who vanished into the shadows after committing a crime. Make sure to like this video, subscribe, and stay till the end to discover all the details behind this twisted incident. Genesis Patricia Tanksley's life seemed relatively normal from the outside. She had recently ended a long relationship with her ex-husband, Lazarus Tanksley. What many didn't know, however, was that their marriage was filled with tension, fights, and resentment. Genesis had spent years in a marriage that drained her emotionally, and the end of it left her feeling free, but also furious. She had tried to keep the peace for the sake of their children, but deep inside, her anger simmered. On the night of January 1st, 2025, everything came to a head in a way no one could have predicted. Around 1 a.m., Genesis found herself face-to-face with her ex-husband. Their conversation started out calm, but it quickly escalated. Words were exchanged, hurtful things were said, and before either of them could really process what was happening, Genesis did something that would change their lives forever. With a heavy heart and a trembling hand, she picked up a weapon and aimed it at Lazarus. The shot rang through the silence of the night, and everything went black. After the shocking act, Genesis didn't know what to do. Panic and fear took over her mind. The room seemed to close in on her as she stared at Lazarus lying motionless on the floor. But instead of calling for help, Genesis made a chilling decision. She would leave him there and not face the consequences. Her mind raced as she hurried out of the room, trying to calm herself down. The weight of her actions was too much to bear, but it was done. Lazarus was hurt. She knew that. But did he deserve to die? Genesis tried to compose herself before heading out of the house. She drove to the hospital, leaving her ex-husband's body behind, and made a cold decision to drop him off there as if he were a stranger in need of medical attention. When she reached the hospital, her expression was as calm as could be, though inside, she was torn between fear and relief. She parked the car, dragged Lazarus out, and left him at the hospital door. But did anyone suspect something wasn't quite right? Would the truth ever come to light? As Genesis left Lazarus at the hospital, she was not alone in her silence. An unknown figure had been watching her from a distance. This silent witness had seen everything and understood the gravity of what had just occurred. But what would they do? Would they speak up, or would they remain hidden, as afraid of the truth as Genesis herself? Meanwhile, the hospital staff, initially unaware of the full situation, began to notice the strange circumstances surrounding Lazarus's arrival. The scene was odd. There was something too cold about it. Doctors rushed to Lazarus's side, trying desperately to save him. His wounds were severe, but he was still breathing. The staff couldn't fathom why anyone would leave a man in such a condition, with no explanation and no answers. However, they did their best to stabilize him. Still, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Was this just another case of a person in need of medical care, or was something darker at play? The staff continued their efforts, but little did they know that the case had only just begun. Detectives quickly arrived on the scene after Lazarus's condition was assessed. They were told about the mysterious circumstances surrounding his arrival, but it didn't take long before they began asking questions that Genesis wasn't prepared to answer. What exactly had happened that night? Why had someone dropped Lazarus off in such a dire condition? And most importantly, who was responsible for his injuries? It wasn't long before the investigation moved forward with surprising speed. As detectives pieced together the puzzle, they began to question the people closest to Lazarus and Genesis. With each passing day, Genesis felt the heat of the investigation closing in. The hospital was already a potential crime scene, but how much longer could she keep up the act? She had tried to leave the scene behind her, but her past was catching up to her. Detectives interviewed witnesses and reviewed hospital surveillance footage. What they discovered was enough to spark a new wave of suspicion. Genesis was at the center of it all. She had dropped Lazarus off, and now it was only a matter of time before her involvement became impossible to ignore. As the investigation continued, Genesis's nerves were tested like never before. The pressure mounted as detectives pieced together the events leading up to the shooting. More and more people began to question her story. Did Genesis really have the right to claim self-defense? Had she acted out of desperation, or was there something more sinister at play? Meanwhile, Lazarus's condition worsened. He had suffered severe internal injuries, and doctors weren't sure if he would survive. The clock was ticking, and everyone knew the consequences of this case would be far-reaching. At the same time, the relationship between Genesis and Lazarus came under the microscope. What had led to this tragic event? Those closest to the couple began to reveal troubling details. Genesis had been unhappy for years, often confiding in others about how she felt trapped and frustrated. But did that justify what she had done? Could anyone understand the pain she had been feeling, or was she simply using her struggles as an excuse for her actions? As the investigation deepened, more questions were raised than answers provided. The turning point in the investigation came when detectives uncovered a crucial piece of evidence. A witness had seen Genesis leaving the hospital that night. This revelation was a game-changer. It seemed like Genesis's attempt to cover up her actions was starting to unravel. Who was this mysterious witness, and why had they stayed silent for so long? Was this someone with ties to the case, or were they simply an innocent bystander caught in the web of Genesis's lies? The witness's statement was vague, but it confirmed one important fact. Genesis had been at the scene and had played a role in Lazarus's injuries. Detective Hernandez knew this was the breakthrough they needed, but it wasn't enough yet. The question now was how to prove Genesis's guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. Was there more evidence hidden in plain sight? Could they track down the missing pieces of this twisted puzzle? The tension was unbearable as the investigation entered a critical phase. Genesis was a woman torn between two worlds. On one hand, she was desperate to escape the truth, but on the other, her guilt was eating her alive. She could feel the walls closing in, but she didn't know how to stop it. Her days were filled with anxiety, each moment bringing her closer to the inevitable. Would she face justice for what she had done, or would she find a way to slip away unnoticed? As she waited for the next phase of the investigation, Genesis found herself questioning everything. In the quiet moments of reflection, Genesis replayed the events in her mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. Could she have done things differently? Could she have walked away from the situation without violence? She knew she couldn't undo what had been done, but she also knew that the consequences were coming for her. The uncertainty of her future hung over her like a dark cloud, and she couldn't escape the dread that followed her everywhere. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now it was only a matter of time before the world found out. Just when it seemed like the investigation couldn't get any more intense, a surprising development came to light. Lazarus had regained consciousness. The doctors were amazed at his resilience, and he was finally able to speak. His first words were filled with confusion and fear, but soon the detectives found themselves sitting down with him, ready to hear his side of the story. What he had to say could either clear Genesis's name or seal her fate once and for all. Lazarus's recollection of that night was fragmented and clouded by the trauma, but he remembered enough to confirm one thing. Genesis had been the one to shoot him. The details of their conversation were murky, but his recognition of her involvement was undeniable. As Lazarus continued to speak, the investigators knew they were getting closer to the truth. Genesis had tried to cover her tracks, but Lazarus's words were the final piece of the puzzle. Was it an act of revenge, or was there more to the story than Lazarus was willing to admit? As the pressure mounted, Genesis's behavior became more erratic. She started distancing herself from her family and friends, becoming increasingly paranoid that someone would expose her. Her once quiet, controlled life was now filled with anxiety and fear. She couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. Every time someone knocked at her door, her heart would race. Would this be the day the police came for her? Would she be arrested and forced to face the consequences of her actions? The reality of what she had done was starting to weigh heavily on her. At the same time, Genesis found herself thinking about Lazarus. Had he deserved what happened to him? Part of her wanted to apologize, to ask for his forgiveness. But deep down, she knew it was too late. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the days wore on, her guilt and shame consumed her, and she began to unravel. What had started as a desperate act of anger was now threatening to destroy her entire life. Would she be able to live with the choices she had made? The investigation took another unexpected turn when the police uncovered more details about Genesis's life and the reasons behind the shooting. As they dug deeper, they found that Genesis had been suffering from emotional neglect for years. Her marriage to Lazarus had been toxic and abusive, and the emotional toll it had taken on her was immense. Some of her friends spoke about how she had tried to escape the relationship multiple times, but had always been dragged back in. The detectives began to question whether Genesis's actions were the result of a long period of emotional strain, or if it was simply a case of cold-blooded violence. However, this new information only complicated the investigation. Could Genesis's emotional state be used as a defense, or did it only make her actions worse? The detectives had a difficult decision to make. They knew that there were no easy answers in a case like this. Was this an act of self-defense, or a calculated attempt to silence a man she had once loved? The search for the truth was no longer just about what happened that night. It was about understanding the complex web of emotions and motivations that had led to this tragic moment. As the investigation continued, more secrets came to light. Friends and family of both Genesis and Lazarus began to share their perspectives on the troubled relationship. It wasn't just the shooting that had been hidden in the shadows for so long. It was the years of lies, manipulation, and emotional abuse. Genesis had often confided in her friends about her unhappiness in the marriage, but many of them had never known the full extent of her pain. Some of them, in hindsight, even wished they had intervened earlier, but they had been blind to the depth of the problem. On the other hand, Lazarus's side of the story was just as complicated. He too had his demons. The detectives were surprised to uncover that Lazarus had a history of cheating and controlling behavior. The couple's relationship had been full of contradictions, moments of love mixed with cruelty. This made the situation even more difficult for the authorities. How could they ever understand who was truly to blame for the chaos that had ensued? As news of the shooting spread, the case became a media sensation. Reporters descended on Mobile, Alabama, eager to get a glimpse of the woman at the center of it all. Genesis's name was splashed across headlines, and the public quickly formed opinions about what had happened that night. Some believed she was justified in her actions, a woman pushed to the edge by years of neglect and mistreatment. Others saw her as a cold-blooded murderer who had taken matters into her own hands with no regard for the consequences. Genesis became the subject of heated debate. Some people sympathized with her, while others condemned her actions. The constant media attention only added to her stress. It was hard to leave the house without being confronted by the public's opinions. Her every move was scrutinized, and she could feel the weight of their judgment on her shoulders. Would the media's portrayal of her influence the way the case would unfold in court? As Lazarus fought for his life in the hospital, he began to gather strength, both physically and mentally. He knew the truth, and now it was his turn to make sure that justice was served. The man who had been shot by the woman he once loved now had a chance to speak out. Lazarus's testimony would be pivotal in the case against Genesis, and he was determined to make sure that everything came to light. But he also had his own demons to confront. Lazarus's healing process was slow, and the physical scars left by the shooting would never fully disappear. But it was the emotional scars that hurt the most. His feelings of betrayal were overwhelming, and he couldn't understand how Genesis could do something so violent after everything they had been through together. Despite the pain, Lazarus knew he had to stay strong. This wasn't just about his recovery. It was about making sure Genesis was held accountable for what she had done. Detectives continued to gather evidence, piece by piece. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and forensic reports all pointed to Genesis as the person responsible for the shooting. The case against her seemed to be growing stronger with each passing day. But there was one piece of evidence that stood out above the rest, a recorded confession. It wasn't a direct admission of guilt, but Genesis had made a statement to a close friend about what happened that night. The confession was vague, but it was enough to raise serious doubts about her innocence. The detectives knew that this could be the turning point they had been waiting for. But the question remained, would Genesis try to cover up the truth again, or would she come clean? The tension was palpable as the investigation reached a critical juncture. Would justice be served, or would Genesis find a way to escape the consequences of her actions? As the days dragged on, the pressure on Genesis continued to mount. Her life, once seemingly ordinary, was now consumed by the weight of the investigation and the scrutiny of the public eye. She couldn't go anywhere without being stared at, whispered about, or confronted with questions about the shooting. The tension was unbearable. Genesis tried to go about her daily routine, but it felt like she was suffocating in her own skin. Every moment was a constant reminder of what she had done, and the walls around her seemed to be closing in. Meanwhile, detectives continued to build their case. The evidence was starting to form a clear picture of what had transpired that night. It wasn't just about the shooting anymore. It was about the larger context of Genesis's life. How much of this was a result of years of emotional pain, and how much was the product of a moment of pure rage? The investigation had uncovered a complex web of emotions, secrets, and lies, but the truth still felt elusive. Would the full story ever come to light? Genesis's mental state was deteriorating quickly. The guilt that had been simmering inside her since the night of the shooting now began to consume her completely. She couldn't escape the haunting thoughts of what she had done. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lazarus lying on the ground, blood pooling around him. The image was burned into her memory, and she couldn't shake it. At times, she wondered if she had made the right choice, but deep down, she knew it didn't matter. What was done, and there was no turning back. The pressure from the investigation, the public scrutiny, and her own inner turmoil all began to take a toll on Genesis. She couldn't sleep, couldn't think clearly. Every day felt like a battle to stay sane. She found herself crying without warning, caught in a storm of emotions that she couldn't control. She had never imagined her life would spiral so far out of control. As the investigation picked up speed, Genesis reached a breaking point. She knew that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around her. It was late one evening when Genesis finally made a decision that would change everything. After days of constant internal struggle, she couldn't bear the weight of her secret any longer. Sitting alone in her apartment, Genesis broke down. For the first time since the shooting, she let the full truth wash over her. In that moment, she made a quiet confession to herself, the truth that she had tried so hard to bury. She had acted out of anger, out of frustration, and out of a desperate need for control. She had pulled the trigger not just out of self-defense, but because she wanted to hurt Lazarus in the same way he had hurt her for years. As Genesis's tears fell, she knew that this admission wouldn't change anything. The investigation was still ongoing, and the evidence was still mounting against her. But for the first time, she felt a sense of release, as though she had finally unburdened herself. What came next, however, was the real question. Would she confess to the authorities, or would she continue to hide behind her lies and deceptions? As Genesis's story continued to unfold, it was clear that public opinion was deeply divided. Some people sympathized with her, understanding the deep emotional scars that had driven her to commit such a violent act. They believed she had been pushed to the edge by years of neglect and abuse. Others, however, saw her as nothing more than a cold-hearted murderer who had acted out of pure malice. The media sensationalized every detail of her case, casting her as either a tragic victim or a ruthless villain, depending on who you asked. Genesis watched all of this from the sidelines, feeling both empowered and trapped by the way the world was judging her. She couldn't control how the public saw her, but she could control what happened next. Would she take responsibility for her actions, or would she try to slip away and leave the past behind? The pressure of the public's opinion was weighing on her, but in the end, it would be the court that would decide her fate. As the case continued to unfold, the question became, who would the jury believe? The investigation reached a critical point when the police uncovered a key piece of evidence that made Genesis's involvement undeniable. It wasn't just the confession from her friend or Lazarus's testimony. It was the forensic evidence. The bullet found inside Lazarus's body was linked to a gun that Genesis had owned. There was no doubt that she had been the one to fire the shot. The detectives had gathered everything they needed, and the case against her was airtight. But despite the overwhelming evidence, Genesis still insisted that she had acted out of self-defense. She claimed that she was afraid for her life in that moment, but many people were starting to question the validity of her story. Had she really been in danger, or had she simply been looking for a way to take control of a situation that had spiraled out of her hands? The evidence was clear, but Genesis still had one last card to play: her own defense. Would she be able to convince the jury that her actions were justified, or was she simply a woman who had crossed the line in a fit of rage? As the trial approached, the defense team turned their attention to Lazarus's character. They needed to paint a picture of him that would make Genesis's actions seem justified. They argued that Lazarus had been abusive toward her, both physically and emotionally, and that the shooting had been an act of self-defense. But as more people came forward to speak about Lazarus's past, it became clear that the truth about him was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Lazarus had been manipulative, but he had also been a victim of his own demons. Was he truly deserving of the fate Genesis had handed him, or had she acted out of her own deep-seated anger? The courtroom became a battleground of emotions as both sides fought to present their version of the truth. The defense painted Lazarus as a monster, while the prosecution argued that Genesis's actions were motivated by more than just self-defense. As the trial progressed, it became evident that the truth was murkier than anyone could have predicted. The jury had to decide whether to see Genesis as a victim of circumstance or as a cold-blooded killer. The outcome of the trial would determine the future of both her and Lazarus, who was fighting to survive the wounds she had inflicted. The trial had reached its most intense point. Both sides had laid out their cases, and now it was time for the jury to deliberate. Genesis sat in the courtroom, her hands trembling as she listened to the closing arguments. Her defense attorney had painted a picture of a woman driven to violence after years of emotional and physical abuse, while the prosecution argued that no matter the circumstances, Genesis had made a choice to end her ex-husband's life. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Genesis's fate was now in the hands of 12 strangers who had heard the evidence and arguments. She couldn't help but replay everything in her mind. Had she really been justified in pulling the trigger? She had felt so powerless for so long, trapped in a cycle of frustration and emotional neglect. But could that ever justify what she had done? She stared at the jury, trying to read their faces, wondering what they were thinking. Would they see her as a victim, or would they see her as a dangerous woman who needed to be stopped? The silence in the courtroom was deafening, and Genesis could feel the weight of her actions closing in on her like a vice. Days passed as the jury deliberated, and Genesis's anxiety grew with each tick of the clock. The anticipation was unbearable. When the verdict finally came, it was delivered with a sense of finality. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as the foreman stood up to read the jury's decision. Genesis's heart raced, and she could barely breathe as the words were spoken. "Guilty," the foreman announced. The word echoed through the courtroom, and Genesis's world seemed to crumble around her. The reality of what had just happened hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been found guilty of attempted murder. The weight of the verdict was almost too much to bear, and Genesis sank back in her seat, stunned. She had tried to convince herself that she was justified in her actions, but the jury had spoken. The judge, who had been quiet throughout the trial, now stood to announce the sentencing. Genesis's fate was sealed, and the consequences of her violent decision were about to unfold. As Genesis was escorted from the courtroom, the full impact of her actions began to sink in. She had spent so much time trying to justify what she had done, but now, faced with the reality of her guilt, she couldn't escape the truth. She had made a choice to end someone's life, no matter how complicated their relationship had been. Now, she would have to live with the consequences. As she walked down the hall to be taken into custody, Genesis couldn't help but wonder how her life had come to this point. How had she allowed herself to be consumed by anger? And how could she have ever thought that this was the only way out? In her cell, Genesis sat quietly, staring at the cold walls around her. For the first time, she allowed herself to confront the truth. She had ruined both her life and Lazarus's life in one reckless moment. She had destroyed everything they had built together. And for what? To gain control. To escape her pain? Now, with nothing but time to reflect, Genesis felt the weight of her decisions like a heavy burden. The world outside had moved on, but her life was in ruins. Meanwhile, Lazarus was still fighting for his life in the hospital. He had come close to death that night, but his will to survive was stronger than anyone had anticipated. His road to recovery was long and painful, but he was determined to get back to some semblance of normalcy. Every day, he fought to regain his strength, both physically and mentally. The wounds Genesis had inflicted on him would never fully heal, but he was alive, and that for him was enough. Despite the pain, Lazarus also found himself reflecting on his marriage to Genesis. He had been far from perfect, but he couldn't help but wonder if there had been a way to avoid the violent confrontation that led to the shooting. He could have tried harder, listened more, or done things differently. But the truth was that their relationship had been unhealthy for a long time, and both of them had played a part in the chaos that had consumed them. Lazarus knew that Genesis's actions were unforgivable, but he also knew that he had been equally responsible for the breakdown of their marriage. Genesis's sentencing came soon after the verdict. She stood in front of the judge, her heart heavy with regret and sorrow. The room was filled with tension as the judge read out the charges, followed by the punishment. The judge's voice was stern as he delivered the sentence. Genesis was to serve a lengthy prison term for attempted murder, with a possibility for parole after 10 years. The sentence was a harsh reminder of the consequences of her actions, and it left Genesis with little hope for redemption. She was escorted out of the courtroom, her hands cuffed and her heart sinking. She had been given a chance to start over, but now that chance was lost. Genesis's life would be defined by this moment, and she would spend the next decade in prison, grappling with the truth of what she had done. Would she find redemption? Would she be able to make amends for her actions? Or would she remain a prisoner of her own guilt for the rest of her life? Only time would tell. As Genesis's story became a cautionary tale for others, the people around her also had to come to terms with the aftermath of what had happened. Lazarus, though physically scarred, found a way to rebuild his life, focusing on his recovery and moving forward. He found peace in knowing that he had survived and could one day leave the past behind him. Genesis's family, who had once stood by her, were now left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. They couldn't deny the pain that had been caused, but they also couldn't ignore the complex emotional layers of the situation. Some of them supported her, believing that she had acted out of a need to escape years of abuse. Others felt betrayed and angry, struggling to understand how their loved one could have crossed such a line. The family was torn, and it would take time before they could come to terms with the tragic events. In prison, Genesis spent her days reflecting on the life she had lost. She knew she would never be able to undo the damage she had caused, but she could try to find a way to live with it. The guilt was overwhelming, and there were days when it felt like she would drown in it. But she knew she couldn't give up. She had made mistakes, yes, but she was still alive, and that meant there was a chance for redemption. Genesis spent her time reading, writing, and trying to understand herself better. It wasn't easy, but it was the only path forward. Her life, once filled with anger and frustration, had now been reduced to a prison cell. But in the solitude, Genesis began to see things differently. She had allowed herself to be consumed by her emotions, and in doing so, she had destroyed everything. She had learned the hard way that nothing, no matter how painful or difficult, was worth throwing away your humanity over. The question remained, could Genesis find peace within herself, or would she be forever trapped by the mistakes she had made? Years passed, and Genesis's life in prison became one of quiet introspection and slow, painful healing. She had become a different person from the woman who had once pulled the trigger out of anger and desperation. With time, the raw edges of her guilt softened, though it never truly disappeared. Genesis attended therapy sessions and counseling groups, slowly learning how to come to terms with her actions. But the real change came when she began reaching out to others, offering help, sharing her story, and encouraging those around her to learn from her mistakes. She had accepted that her past could never be erased, But she also realized that redemption wasn't something that came easily or quickly. It was a process, a journey that involved humility, reflection, and most importantly, change. Genesis knew she could never fully heal the wounds she had caused, but perhaps, through her own transformation, she could make a difference in someone else's life. The years in prison had taught her the value of inner peace, and she finally understood that no amount of anger or resentment was worth the price she had paid. Genesis's story is a tragic reminder that pain, when left unchecked, can lead to destructive choices. But it is also a testament to the power of reflection, self-forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. The consequences of one reckless moment can shape a person's life in ways they could never predict. But it's never too late to choose a different path. Genesis may never be able to undo the damage she caused, but she has learned that peace begins with the decision to face the truth and take responsibility for one's actions. As for Lazarus, his life has found a new beginning too, though he will forever carry the scars of that fateful night. He has slowly rebuilt his life, trying to move past the trauma of the shooting. But both he and Genesis know that their lives will always be intertwined by the pain of the past, a pain they must both learn to live with. The journey of healing, both for Genesis and for Lazarus, is ongoing. They may never fully understand each other's pain, but perhaps, in time, they will find a way to forgive, if not each other, then themselves. Thank you for staying with us through this emotional journey. If you found Genesis and Lazarus' story impactful, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more true stories and deep dives into complex real-life situations. We appreciate your support, and we look forward to sharing more with you in the future. Stay safe, and take care of yourselves and each other.